how much harder do I have to work? How much better do I have to be? And eventually you don't realize it, but we end up teaching our kids, society, that they're not enough. You know, and I think that I've had to do so much unlearning, especially in my 20s, to get to a point where I'm like, my bare minimum is enough.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode here of Off the Cuff, where conversations lead to inspiration. I'm your host, Christian Palmer, and today I'm joined by one of the leading voices in racial justice and digital organizing. She is the co-founder of Freedom March NYC, one of the largest youth-led civil rights organizations in the country. After working in Obama White House in 2016 on criminal justice reforms, she became a global voice in activism. Her work has been featured in Forbes, Rolling Stone, Vogue, CNN, Financial Times, and more. She was honored as the voice of justice on the Oprah Winfrey Network by Vital Voices and NowThisNEXT. She was also named as one of the 12 recipients to receive the Muhammad Ali Humanitarian Award, and more recently was named as one of the newest commentators for NOWThis, the #1 most watched brand globally on social. Lastly, she was featured on the PBS docu-series Making Black America, exploring the relationship between civil rights movements of the 1960s and the fight for racial justice today. Trust me, this is a conversation you don't want to miss. We are here with the one and only Chelsea Miller. Chelsea, what's going on? Talk to me. How you feeling?
I'm feeling good. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great. I'm so happy we're here. Thank you so much for making time, for making space for us to have this conversation. It's one that is needed. I feel like you've been doing some incredible work on the ground, in the media, and I'm just grateful to have you in this space to share a little bit more about that story.
Well, I'm excited to be here, and I think this conversation is going to be great.
Yeah, let's do it. So I want to talk about, before every episode, right, before we get into the amazing work that you do, we like to talk a little bit more about the early days and the early upbringings. And I want to lean in a little bit more about your story, how you grew up in Brooklyn by a single mom who was also a social worker, right? Talk to me a little bit more about the early principles and the foundational element that your mom was able to instill in you, how you view the world today.
Yeah, definitely. So interestingly enough, I was speaking at an event yesterday in Long Island, and that was one of the things that I spoke about, and it was in front of high school students for the most part from all over New York City. And you know, when I talk about my formative years, if you will, I think that it's important for people to remember that of course they know me because of my work with Freedom March NYC, but I've been doing this work for over 10 years, right? And that started when I was a teenager and seeing, right, just the issues that were going on in my community and the things that were happening and wanting to create some type of change. And that really stems from my story. That stems from being first generation American, raised by a single mother. You know, my mom came to Brooklyn in the 90s, and she always tells the story to our entire family, my siblings and I, so that we never forget it, that when she first came to New York, she was sleeping in a McDonald's and had to figure it out, you know, just had one dress to her name and, you know, had to hustle and was doing hair braiding and then doing other things, was trying to make ends meet. And I think for me, just knowing that story and consistently being reminded of that story when I was younger, it's the immigrant story, you know, and it's the story of growing up in New York, growing up in the concrete jungle and trying to figure it out. And, you know, when people ask me why I got into the work of social impact, the reality is that that was what I was exposed to at a really young age. You know, my mom, she was a social worker when she was able to get her degree. And for me, I grew up, when she left social work, she then turned the second story of our 2-family house into a group home for young girls. So I grew up actually having foster sisters, which is something that, well, now people know because I talk about it a lot. But growing up at the time, people didn't know, right? Because I would introduce my foster sister just as my sister. So even my friends didn't really know that I had foster sisters, because to me, they were my sisters. Like we grew up together. I still call, like their daughters my nieces. We still do things together, things of that sort. So yeah, it definitely shaped me. I think I learned from a really young age that even though you may have a story, there are so many people out there who have experienced so much hardship and challenges in life. And as much as we can act like these things don't exist, the truth is that they do. And especially the systems that we create are impacting the people who are most vulnerable. You're talking about immigrants, you're talking about kids in the foster care system, you're talking about kids who are experiencing homelessness, families who are experiencing homelessness. And so the truth is that there's always more that we could do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you mentioned that it took you a while to actually introduce your sisters as the reality of it, foster sisters. Tell me about that pivotal moment where you kind of owned that and you grasped onto it and you started projecting that a little bit more.
So I don't think it was ever difficult, because it was nothing that I was ever ashamed of, but I think it was more so the relevancy of that part of my life, right? Like when people started asking me, and especially once we were on the front lines a lot, media was like, what gave you the strength to do XYZ, or like what gave you the courage? And I'm just like, I don't know. Like if I had to think about it, if I had to really take a look back at my life, then perhaps there were those moments that most people don't experience that to me was my normal, and then unpacking all of those different aspects of my life was when I was like, yeah, I guess that was the point where I did have those kind of just turning points in my life of just understanding things. But at the time, to me, it was home, it was family, right? So I don't see them as my foster sisters, I see them as family. And when you have family who have experienced so much different trauma, even at the hands of, again, the foster care system, before coming to my home, some of my foster sisters experienced so much abuse in the foster care system. And it was only through being able to build those relationships and, the work that my mom did to build those relationships with them as well, that they felt safe enough to be able to talk about these things and advocate for themselves. And so I think that it's just always been a part of my story. And so for me, it wasn't really a question whether or not I would be shaped by it. I think it was then understanding what would I do with that part of my life, and how would I use that as I step into the world. And I think I've just always innately decided that I want to be someone who's going to make a difference for the younger version of myself, but also the version of my mom who's sleeping in McDonald's, the version of my sisters who, before coming to my home, those versions of ourselves where we need people to advocate and be there to get us to those safe places. Who is going to champion us to get there? And I decided I was going to do that.
Yeah, and the phenomenal thing that it started in a household, but I think your curiosity, that hunger, the ambition, it explored and morphed into not only your household, but into your neighborhoods, into your communities, into the country, and now even from a global footprint, right? You, as that little girl growing up in this environment, how were you able to just envision that you wanted more than just the four walls that you were in?
So I think for me, I always was just really curious, but I also liked creating a lot of trouble. And so when I was younger, my family, so I'm actually second youngest. It's 5 girls and 1 boy. And so I think I just always innately was just very curious. I was just troublemaker. When I was younger, that's what my family used to call me, trouble. And I'm Jamaican, so sometimes you just end up with that nickname with sticks. So,
does it still stick today?
Yeah, they still think that I was a troublemaker, which is fine. I'll own it. Just make it a part of my story, I guess. But yeah, so I think I've just always naturally just questioned things. And I also think a lot of that comes from, again, just being exposed to so much at an early age. Even though my mom, of course, tried to protect us from a lot, and, your parents try to shelter you from a lot. But when you grow up in New York, there's no sheltering.
Right.
Like, if you're being serious, you know, you go on the subway, you see people getting into fights, you see people sleeping on the train, right? Like, those things are normal for us. And if you grow up in a sheltered environment, you don't see those things, you know? And so I feel like for a lot of people that are from New York, you grow up naturally having to grow up very fast, you know? Taking the subway, there are things that you have to learn about your own safety, about people, about, you know, the different things that your parents will show you on the news as a way to be like, make sure you come home after school and, you know, don't get off the train and hang out with your friends. So things like that, I think naturally I just always just asking questions like, why do we have to be in a community where like this is the normal? Like, why can't we play after a certain time outside? But when I watch the movies, I see all of the little white kids playing until, you know, the crack of dawn, and their parents just let them go on their bikes and they, you know, disappear into the sunset. Like, why can't that be what we do when we're outside playing? Why can we only play in our apartment building during the summertime? Or like, why do we have to be in? You know, it's like all of these different questions. And my mom did an incredible thing when we were younger to advocate to actually send us to a school outside of our school district. And so the schools that I typically would go to were a lot of, you know, it was predominantly white, but my neighborhood was predominantly black. And so I had questions. Why is it that, you know, the classmate next to me, her parent could just pick her up from school across the street, but I gotta go and take the B41 bus for an hour to get home? You know, like, why is that? Why is it that they get to do all these activities, but I can't, or I can't go on this field trip? Like, different things like that you just are curious about as a child. And as much as, again, your parents try to protect you from it, you realize that there are two realities of the world, you know, the tale of two cities, the tale of two Americas, and all of these different things that as you grow older and you become more curious about it and you start asking those questions, you get answers that you have to face, you know. And I think that for me, I don't think it is as simple as us just looking at what's happening on our blocks. I think we have to look at what's happening on a global scale, and we have to understand our history to be able to tell that story. Because I'm not here because I was just, you know, dropped and existed. I come from a family, you know, I come from a community, I come from a legacy that if we are to understand where we're going, we have to understand where we came from.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And I think that morphs and transitions so well, because when you talk about legacy, when you talk about understanding where you're going, you are doing the phenomenal things right now with Freedom March or NYC. But I think sometimes we have to understand that you've been doing this for a while, right? And that wasn't the first nonprofit organization that you launched. You launched Women Everywhere Believe. And you had tremendous amount of success in that as well, right? 20 plus chapters, 8 states, and I think you were telling me that there was actually a chapter in India as well.
Yeah.
You know, so talk about global footprint, right? Talk to me a little bit more about the success that you achieved there and the root of it and why it was developed in the first place.
Yeah, so I always say that We Believe walked so that Freedom March NYC could run. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the organizing skills that I developed that prepared me for 2020 happened even before then when I was doing work with We Believe. So I actually started We Believe when I was at Columbia, and the reason why I started it with my co-founder, Akua Obeng-Akrofi, was because we were looking around on campus and we realized that there were not a lot of women who came from similar backgrounds as us, Black women, women of color, right, coming from communities, families, et cetera, that typically, right, statistically, you're not supposed to be here. And so the question then becomes, how are we creating pipelines and opportunities for young girls to know that these spaces are for them too? And so we launched a program in Harlem. That was the first program that we did, and it was a success. You know, it was incredible. One of the stories that I always tell people is that it was about our 6th or 7th week of programming, and we had a question that we asked the girls. The theme for the week was relationships and self-esteem. And one of the questions we asked them was, where was the first place you learned how to love? And mind you, this was a group of middle schoolers who, You know, middle school is an interesting age because I think that you are entering adulthood, but you've seen so much that in a lot of ways you already feel like you're there.
Yeah.
And so figuring out how to balance that in the midst of everything else going on in the world. And so when we asked them that question, what followed, I never in my life would have thought would have happened. Because as soon as we asked them where was the first place that you learned how to love, they started thinking about it, and they started talking about, you know, for the first time, some of them, their parents who were incarcerated, and the stories of, you know, how just like the sacrifice and the love that even though they don't see them every single day, you know, the relationship that they have, talking about the family members that took them in when their parents couldn't raise them, started talking about just so many different things. And eventually it got to a point where the girls started opening up about abuse. And one of them talked about having a boyfriend and being assaulted, right? And mind you, again, 12, 13 years old. And what followed was in a group of about 15 girls, about a third of them shared that they had been sexually assaulted. Mind you, the teachers in the room were shocked.
Wow.
There were guidance counselors in the room. Their jaw was on the floor because they were like, how were you guys able to get this out of these girls in 6 to 7 weeks? We met with them about once or twice a week. How were you able to do that? And I said, this is what happens when you create spaces for young people to be heard. This is what happens when you create spaces for them to feel like they are not defined by the current moment and their circumstances, but they have a greater story that they're telling in their lives. This is what happens when you give them the space to lead, you know. And I think that that was such a turning point in my own work. And that is what propelled us to be like, you know what, we're not just going to do this in Harlem. We're going to start chapters where we train other college women on their campuses to be able to do these programs in their communities. And over the span of 2 years, we worked with women leaders like Tarana Burke. We did so much work on building out the leadership initiative. We honored Tarana Burke at the heels of, you know, like the Me Too movement. We were across 20 plus chapters. We were at Ivy Leagues, we were at HBCUs, we were at city colleges. We were, you know, leading some of the largest conferences.
Too.
Albany, Albany was one of our actually strongest chapters. They had so many people. And they would travel every year coming to her Legacy Weekend. That's what we called it at Columbia University. We were able to get students that were at Columbia and our Columbia chapter to house the students that were coming in. Wow. And so we had a whole system that was set up of like bringing sponsors. We were doing career fairs. Mind you, we weren't even a recognized student organization at the time when we were doing this, you know, but that just tells you the scale of the work. At any given conference, we would have about 500 to 600 people coming in and out, again, as an unrecognized student organization on Columbia University's campus, right? But that was the work. And in 2020, we were actually on tour with We Believe when the pandemic hit, because keeping in mind that when the pandemic hit in New York, it was March, and that was Women's History Month. And so we were doing a tour where we were going to different middle schools throughout New York City, launching a program for students. And it was about, I think, the third day into the tour when, you know, New York City was like, everyone go inside for 2 weeks and then you'll be back out and the pandemic will be over. And clearly that never happened. It was more like 2 years. But yeah, that's what happened with We Believe. And a lot of the work that we did there then just transferred over to digitally, you know, working more so directly with schools and still trying to figure out what the model looks like, because I just think that times have changed. And I think also understanding that just because you have 20 plus you know, chapters and you're doing all this work, that doesn't necessarily always equate to having a sustainable model for your business and your nonprofit. And so making sure that you sustain that model first, the funding, before then stretching yourself too thin, right? So I think that that is what was happening. We were doing so well from just like an organizing perspective without thinking about how do we sustain ourselves in this work, how do we make sure we have salaries, how do we make sure we do all these things, because we were college students when we started it. We weren't thinking about that. We were just like, we want to do this, we're going to do it. Even if we don't have any money, guess what? We'll figure it out. Versus now, obviously, you're not in college. You have to be more intentional about the longevity of that work.
Absolutely. And I love that. And I think you mentioned a lot of things there. And one of the main things that you say, you're being very intentional on how you pivot, especially now how the world is, right? And I think in 2020, it was a very, pivotal moment for the entire world and also to you individually, right? Because that's, although you had to pivot from We Believe, you had to now a birth of Freedom March NYC developed. Talk about that transition and what you were able to learn, because you talked about a little bit, right, about creating the foundation and being sustainable. What other key lessons that you feel like you learned from the first nonprofit in order for you to be successful in Freedom March NYC?
Not taking no for an answer, I think, is really important when it comes to business. I would also say being able to do a lot with a little. A lot of times we feel like we have to wait until we have everything in place in order to create that business, launch that conference, create whatever impact that you want to see in the world. And I think that I learned really quickly that if you are going to step into a lane that you've never stepped into before, if you are going to forge a path that you've never seen anyone do the way that you're about to do it, you're going to have to bet on yourself. And oftentimes other people are not going to see that vision, and you have to be okay with that and say, guess what, watch me, we'll circle it back.
And how do you mentally prepare yourself? Because I feel like we're all experiencing that. And even for me, when being in platforms like this, holding conversations like this, is just taking a bet on yourself could be tough, because you might be the first one doing it. You might be the first one in your family doing it. Family members might not necessarily understand the long-term vision or how sustainable it is. But that, that sense of almost self-doubt gets in the way. Or like for you, how do you mentally prepare yourself for something or stepping into the unknown?
Yeah, so funny enough, I had left my corporate job a few months before the pandemic hit because I was going full-time with We Believe.
Wow.
And so imagine my surprise, when we have a tour planned, finally we figured out our business model. We're working directly with schools. Like, this is great. Schools are able to, essentially source us to be able to support this type of programming. And we're 3 days in and it's a wrap. Wow. There was no 9 to 5. It was just vibes at that point. And I was just like, you know what? When's the stimulus coming? Like, when is the stimulus coming? And I was just like, but luckily though, I had saved up funds. So I was feeling good about that. I wasn't feeling afraid, because I think that for me, I was like, okay, well, at the end of the day, the entire world is locked down, and this is a time to figure out, what's next. And so I was doing master classes during the pandemic. I was doing all sorts of stuff, because I have always been an entrepreneur, right? During the pandemic, or actually even before the pandemic, I had launched a clothing brand. So I had so many other things that I was doing.
Cooking.
And just, so for me, it was like, okay, at the end of the day, even though this tour is no longer happening, other things still have to be moving. And I think that that's really important, to just make sure that you always have, I know people say 7 streams, but honestly make it 10. There are so many different avenues in order for you to be able to support yourself, think of new ways of, just like building that income base. Because as much as we want to say that, at the end of the day, like money isn't everything, it's not. But it's important to be able to give yourself some type of security to do the things that you need to do. Absolutely. Right? And I think that especially within our communities, we don't talk about the importance of finances enough. We don't talk about the importance of having a plan enough. And I think in that way, a lot of people are scared. When you say, I want to be an entrepreneur, the first thing that people are asking, if you're talking about your family specifically, is like, okay, what's the backup plan?
Yeah, right.
And sometimes you gotta tell them, like, there's no backup plan. Right. We're leading with the vibes. Yeah. So that's really what it is. And I think that for me, I've never been afraid of pivoting. Don't get me wrong, if I need to go get a 9 to 5, I absolutely can do that. I'm more than qualified in several different industries. Yep. And so for me, though, it's the question of time and thinking about, okay, do I need a 9 to 5 or do I just want more capital to do the things that I want to do? And if I want more capital, where can I go and get it that will require the least amount of time, right? And so I think that it's important that we kind of shift our mindset when it comes to money and when it comes to capital and resources and funding and all of these different things, because one thing about me, I'm going to figure it out, you know, and I think that's why Freedom March was so successful, because immediately when people came to us and was like, you know, how can we help? We'll post you on Instagram with a nice little caption. I was like, pause, you know, we're not doing that. We need sustainable funding to support this work, because I've seen what it looks like when we do things like we believe and we put in all of this energy and put in all of this time, but at the same time, there is no funding attached to it to sustainably support it. And so when people were asking, you know, how we can support Freedom March, we had a GoFundMe up within 48 hours. We had our 501c3 within 6 months of launching the organization. We had all of these different things lined up in place to make sure that when the world stopped caring, because we know how it goes with the media and the cycles of the things that people care about, we can still do this work even when people say that this isn't the number one priority, because it's been said. And so I think that that's important, that we had that foresight and we knew that it was coming so we could set the groundwork for it. And so after 2020, we had about 2 years of funding that was solidified for us to be able to do that work. And even now, a lot of what we're doing is pivoting, right? Thinking about, okay, what are some other funding avenues? What are some larger organizations that we built relationships with that we can partner with? What does it look like to house Freedom March perhaps in another organization so that we can focus on the work and someone else can focus on the funding, right? So it's been an incredible journey, honestly. I'm not going to lie, because I think it required a lot of self-discovery, and I think it also required a lot of asking myself, what do I want and how do I want to get there? And so even now, you know, I don't do social impact work because it's the most exciting or lucrative thing, or insert whatever here, right? I do the work because it's important. And so for me, it's important also to be able to separate the work that I do from also the areas in which I'm able to sustainably create change. And so what that looks like is consulting work. What that looks like is partnerships. What that looks like is perhaps launching other businesses and companies and things of that sort, but still holding true to the essence of the work and making sure that it can get done. Because I feel like a lot of the questions I also get is, oh, like, what does it mean to be an activist? Or can I be an activist but want to be a dancer? Or can I be an activist and want to be a singer? Or can I be an activist and want to be all these things? And I think you have to remind people that just because you have a specific interest in the movement does not negate from the fact that you can also have a career, you can also have things that you love to do, and you can have an identity that complements that, but doesn't have to be directly tied to it, because you have to free yourself to be able to also explore and love and practice abundance and do all these other things as well.
I love that so much, and I feel like it is a testament of how much you've grown, how much you've evolved, how much you've done kind of that self-discovery to really understand where you need to pivot or where your calling is next in order for you to also drive that impact as well, right? And I think what's important here is really curating that mindset, and I think you're really instilling us a new mindset to really analyze the foundational work and being able to understand where do we go next in a very intentional way, right? And I think briefly, like when we were talking, you know, I had captured a quote that really resonated with me, and I think this is kind of transitioning into the amazing work that you're doing now from a global footprint and breaking into the media to amplifying our stories, right? To get that expanded reach. So I actually want to read a quote that we actually had a chance to connect, and I think it resonates so well into what we were talking about, because it talks a little bit more about you breaking into the media and really discovering the journey that you're on now. And the quote says, "We can't take on the weight of the world. We can't solve everything. But what we can contribute is to the change we want to see in the world." And I think looking back at where you were 3 years later from Freedom March NYC into where you are now, morphing into this global footprint, expanding our stories, Tell us a little bit more about how important it is for you to now break into the media and amplifying these stories from a global standpoint.
Yeah, so that's funny. I told you this interview at some point is going to be funny because I did not see myself as a media person until I would say about, honestly, at this point, over a year ago. And the reason why I say that is because, and this is why I always say it's so important to give yourself room to evolve and grow and step into your power without being confined to labels of what you are, a career path, or this specific vision that you have of how you see your life going. Because if you asked anyone about 2 years ago, they would constantly just be like, Chelsea, when are you running for office, right? But now everyone's like, when's the show? Or like, when's the next thing that you're doing related to the media? Or like, are you going to be a commentator on this platform and all of these things? And I still definitely get the politics question, but people are more in tune with the media work. And so it's interesting because I think that in different phases of your life, you kind of take on different responsibilities, right, in a lot of ways. And so I've never wanted to be boxed in to the point where I could not use the skills that I have to serve the movement at any given point where it was. And so in 2020, that looked like being on the front lines because that was where we needed to be, and that was the work that needed to be done, because when George Floyd's family made that call to the world of saying, standing in solidarity with my son and not letting him be forgotten, we had a responsibility to show up for him and make sure that his name was not forgotten. And when it was time to show up, we did. And we even went to Minnesota when the verdict came down on Derek Chauvin, right? And so that was about a year of organizing nonstop. But you realize that, of course, there are the stories that we see in our communities, but then a huge part of that and the issue with what we were seeing was the fact that what we were talking about in our communities was not translating in the media. And we know that when you do not tell your story and you do not have control over your story on a large scale, as a result of that, history takes away those narratives for us. And when we talk about the importance of being able to organize future generations to do this work, they have to know the stories and the truth. And so that was why a lot of the work that we did on the ground was in tandem with the work that we were doing in the media. And so it got to a point, though, where a lot of the work was going back to that historical storytelling piece. And so that's when, I did the piece with BET focused on talking about the George Floyd protests. I did another piece with BET focused on the history and the legacy of George Floyd. And so we did a lot of work around the storytelling piece of that, did different campaigns, was featured on ABC, did work with Vogue, did work with all of these different platforms around storytelling of the movement. And especially when we talk about the fact that in this day and age, it's so easy to discredit movements. It's so easy to discredit what movements are created to do and the concerns that we have in our communities. It's so easy to say, this specific leader didn't do XYZ right, as though one, the world isn't made up of flawed systems to begin with and flawed people to begin with, and two, it doesn't change the fact that the work still needs to get done, and so someone has to show up to do that. And I think that it's important, even when we talk about the civil rights movement of the 60s, there was always, some type of divide. There was always some, situation going on at any given point, but that didn't take away from the work. They pit Malcolm X and MLK against each other. And so these are the narratives that we know historically always play out in the media. And so it was important that if we are going to talk about what's happening today, we have to make sure that we regain that control. And so that's how I ended up doing a lot of media work and serving as, a commentator for NowThisNEXT, and I even got a chance to interview MLK's daughter, and doing a lot of work of just like around the storytelling piece of that. And that's still the work that I'm doing. I did a piece with PBS last year with Henry Louis Gates focused on the 60s and connecting it to the youth movement today. And so a lot of times now I'm tapped to do the work of talking about this generational conversation that we're seeing, and I do it because we need it to be done, especially during time periods like this where frontlines work, you're maybe not necessarily seeing it as much of like someone on a megaphone, but there's other places for you to amplify your voice. And so I think finding those different platforms is really important.
And we see it, and we definitely need someone like you to continue to uplift the voices, uplift the stories, and you're doing a phenomenal job, and you touch upon a lot of the success you already had, and I think an interesting point that you had mentioned as well is like oftentimes some things may be overlooked, right? Because oftentimes there's the new headlines, social media can play a big component of it, of just always on, always going, forever evolving, forever changing. But how do you stay grounded and stay focused on the vision and goals that you have set out to do?
Yeah, so I stay focused by honestly tuning out the noise. And the reason why I say that is because, this world is full of distractions. And I think that a lot of people get caught up in optics. I think a lot of people get caught up in what they think that they should be doing versus what they know that they should be doing. I think a lot of people are quick to kind of go with the wave. And I think that for me, I've just realized that if you go with the wave, then you're going to lose yourself very quickly. And you have to know who you are and stand on that. You have to stand on that even when it's not the most popular thing to do, even if that's not the thing that the crowd is doing. You have to do it anyways. I've been doing social justice work before social justice work was quote unquote sexy, before all of these brands now want racial justice leaders to do X, Y, Z, before companies were inviting you to speak to their employees, before politicians were talking about the importance of criminal justice reform and everything else, right? So I think that it's important to stay true to who you are, and I would also say showing up authentically in any space. One of the reasons why Freedom March NYC was so successful was because when we came outside as ourselves, right? We weren't pretending to be anybody. The same energy that we brought in New York City out on the streets when we were leading thousands of people across a bridge is the same exact energy that we brought when we were speaking to politicians, was the same exact energy that we brought when we were speaking to CNN, was the same exact energy that we brought when people were calling us to help them figure out their campaign strategy for presidential elections. The same energy, and so I think that it's really important to show up as yourself, and not everyone's gonna like you. Not everyone is going to invite you back the next time. But best believe that when they call you again, they know what they're calling you for. Because not everybody can move the way that we move, and not everybody can do the work that we do. And it's funny because a lot of people think that the work exists on social media, and so they'll see social media posts and be like, oh, this is what you do. And I'm like, actually, if you really want to know why I'm in the rooms that I'm in, then you would do your research, because it's not because of anything I've ever posted on Instagram, perhaps maybe a flyer, to say come to the protest, but it's really about what happens off of social media, where we've created the most impact. And I think that it's important for people to remember that, that sometimes the most historical moments of your life isn't going to have 10,000 people viewing it. It might just be 5 people that are looking at what you're doing, and that's enough. And so it's a lot of different pieces to what it means, I think, in this day and age to be successful, to create a legacy, to think about the ways of how you want to show up in the world. But the first question that you always have to ask yourself is, why am I doing this and who am I doing this for? And I think once you figure that out, it's going to be a lot easier for you to stay focused on whatever path it is that you're carving out.
I love that. I love that so much, and you're dropping gems like flawlessly, and I love how in tune you are. I love the energy and I love the presence here, because I think it speaks to, like I said, how much you've grown, and the inspiration that you're feeding is one that to say, no matter what entity that you're in, if you understand the why, you understand the foundation, then you're always going to do the work, but in different forms. Right. I want to lean in a little bit more about tribe and creating a tribe and creating a community. because I think without the amazing work that you've done, like we've seen you on the front lines, we've seen you in the headlines, but I think it's important to really recognize the people in the tribe that you have connected and have tapped back into to support you along the way. Tell us a little bit more about kind of that cultivating a tribe, cultivating a team, and how important it is to kind of keep that pipeline and reach back out to support others.
So I would say with creating a tribe, you have to be mindful on, again, it goes back to who you're doing it for and why you're doing it. And I think that for me, I have always been clear that I do not want this story to be about Chelsea Miller, right? I've had folks over the years who have reached out saying, you know, we want to make you the face of this, we want to make you the face of that. What if we branded you this way? What if, you know, we created, and I'm just like, boring, played out, we've seen this before, right? I think that we are a generation that understands the importance of community, that understands the fact that we cannot carry this work alone, no matter what industry you're in, whether or not you are in social impact, you're in entertainment, you're in music, you're in law, you're whatever the industry is, you cannot carry this work alone. And so it's so important to align yourself with people who share similar vision. And I would say not even just similar vision, but also similar values. Because you will see very quickly that not everyone who says that they are for you are for you.
Right.
And not everyone that is in close proximity to you is there because they believe in you. They just want to make sure that when something comes about, that they're around to also collect it. And so it's really important to make sure that you vet your friends, that you ask yourself, do I need more friends or do I need more allies? Do I need more friends or do I need more acquaintances? Do I need more friends or do I need more mentors? Because a lot of times we confuse friends to what are the things that we actually need in our network to grow, build, and sustain ourselves, right? And so I think that it's really important to also be mindful of where people are in their lives. A lot of, and I'll speak specifically for movements because that's the space that I'm in, you realize that they dismantle because of systemic reasons, right? Because movements, the way that they are designed, ultimately implode. But a lot of that is ego-driven, people-driven. And so you have a responsibility to make sure that you are consistently checking your ego. It's so funny because there are so many times where organizations will reach out to work with me specifically or work with Freedom March. And, you know, you can tell a lot about people based on what they value. And a lot of times it's not what they say, it's what they do. It's how they prioritize the work. It's how they talk about the work. It's the language that they use. And so I've gotten really good at discerning between who are our comrades in this work, right? Who are the people who it's 5 a.m. and we need to figure out how we're getting someone out of, you know, jail. Maybe they're booked after a protest. You know the people that you call for that.
Right.
And you know the people that you call maybe if you just need to be, I don't know, inspired. You know, everyone kind of serves a different purpose. And I think that that's really important to the work and just knowing that and knowing yourself. And realistically speaking, you also have to be honest with yourself that people are going to disappoint you. People are not going to live up to the version that you have created of who you want them to be in your life. That's family, that's friends, that's relationships, it's everything in between. And so you have to make that decision that even when people disappoint you, that you are still going to show up for you. And once you get to a point where you're able to do that, that trickles into all the different aspects of your life. That means that when people say that they're going to show up for the work and they don't, they miss that phone call, they say that they're going to be your mentor, you hit them up but they never respond, you brush it off your shoulder because it's not that you expect it, but you prepare for those sorts of things because it's a part of life, right? And in doing so, you also don't take things as personal. You know, I'm a woman of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and one of the things that you learn, you know, is never to take things personal. And that's something that I've carried with me in all the different aspects of my life because it's true. And I think that when you do that, you just give yourself the room to just grow and evolve and do so in such a way that you would be surprised looking back how far you come in the story that you ultimately tell. Because I think that life is about telling our stories and being able to see, you know, the evolution of those chapters. And so for me, I'm just getting started, you know, and I'm excited to see what those next chapters hold. But I don't think that it has to be anything other than what I choose to make it at any given point, because the power is within me, right, to decide what that looks like.
I love that. I feel like you've grown so much, and I keep saying that because you're so tapped in, you're so wise beyond your years, and I'm sure you probably heard it multiple times and stuff, and I think it speaks to the foundational element that, you know, looking back at the earlier moments of mom really pouring into you and seeing kind of what's already in your community. With all the success that you've achieved and the amazing work that you're doing on the ground and where you continue to show up in the media standpoint to glorifying and really setting ourselves and amplifying these stories globally, what would you tell young Chelsea back in Brooklyn who was seeing this in her environment, who had the curiosity of expanding within those four walls, but also was seeing how much the systems were impacting your household at the moment, but seeing how far you've came now? What would you share to that younger self looking back?
I would tell her that you are enough. And I think that that is something that we all should be told when we're younger. And I think that it's something that we should consistently remind ourselves throughout our life. I think that when you grow up in communities like mine, which I'm sure a lot of people who are watching this will be able to resonate with that, you realize that you're taught that you have to be exceptional. You have to be twice as good, right? These are the things that, especially when you talk about the history of being Black in this country, that is the story that they tell us, right? In order to get half as much, you have to work twice as hard. And pair that with being an immigrant. Pair that with being a child of a single mother. Pair that with all of these different things. So then how much more harder do I have to work of not just being a Black person, but operating all of these different intersections? How much harder do I have to work? How much better do I have to be? And eventually you don't realize it, but we end up teaching our kids, society, that they're not enough. You know, and I think that I've had to do so much unlearning, especially in my 20s, to get to a point where I'm like, my bare minimum is enough. When I feel like I'm being mediocre today, that is enough. When I feel like I am not being exceptional, that is enough. And I think that when we do that, we give our kids and we give ourselves so much freedom to be who we are and exist out of the imaginary of how the world wants to see us. And I think that those are the spaces when it's quiet, when it's silent, when I don't have too much going on, when I'm just at peace, because protecting your peace is so important. When you are at peace, those are the times where you are the most innovative, you are the most creative, you are able to do all these things. And I think that the pandemic showed a lot of that to the world, you know? And so I think that that's really important. And another thing that I would say, and this isn't even necessarily just for my younger self, but anyone who's watching this, is that it is so important to set your price. And I say that because if you do not set your price, someone is going to set your price for you. And that doesn't even have to be money. That could be time, that could be your energy, that can be all of these different things. It is so important to know who you are, what you are worth, and your value, because if you don't, someone else is going to take a look at you, assess what that is, and go and sell it. And so I really think that we are at a point, and especially, you know, getting into my mid-20s, I'm so excited to be here, because I'm just like, this is I'm like, this is fun, you know, because I think that I'm at this point where I've done so much, I've accomplished so much, you know, like all of these things that even when people read my bios this day, I'm just like, oh, there's a lot going on here. Or even, you know, I was at an event yesterday and they played me on the video screen. I was not expecting that, because I'm just like, where did they find these videos? Obviously online, but I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is so cringe, you know, because it's still just like very, not funny, but like more like bizarre, right? It's bizarre because when I went outside May 2020 to do this work, I didn't do it with the kind of forethought of, oh, in a couple months, I'm going to be speaking here, I'm going to be doing this, and, you know, then people are going to be celebrating this work. Like, no, when we were outside, we had our black hoodies on, gas masks, our COVID-19 masks, our megaphones, and we were trying to not even be recognized. That's how unsafe it was to be outside. The fact that we were organizing this protest, we had to hide our identities at certain points, right? And even certain protests. And so to now go from that, where we were like undercover, moving with it, you know, when this was even before the curfew, to tell you when Freedom March NYC actually started in New York, because it was because of all the protesting that they enforced the curfew, to which we didn't listen to and were protesting anyways. And that was because of the wave that was happening once more people decided that they were going to come outside. And so it's interesting, you know, to go from a place of an unfriendly president at the time, which is a very mild way of putting it, right? Whereas now I see people protesting and, you know, I'm just like, well, it's nice to not hear a president saying that they're coming in and, you know, bringing in a police state in order to enforce protesters not being able to exercise their First Amendment rights, because that's what was happening, you know? And so it's a completely different day and age, you know, of what it means to be an organizer and to do this work. But at the time, it wasn't, you know, politicians coming and sitting on panels with you talking about sustainable change. It was, we're outside, tell everybody to pull up, and we're going to be here until they convict this killer cop. And so that's what we did.
And we've been seeing amazing work. Listen, as we wrap up here and kind of really kind of make our way towards the final questions, I want to sit down real quick, and well, we are sitting down, right?
Sit down, even downer.
Downer, exactly. You know, I want to take the moment to really understand, because you've achieved so much, but I want to see kind of what the future holds for you. You know, and sometimes it's a difficult question because we just want to be in the present now, right, and really own the present and evolve. But I'm curious to know from your perspective, for someone who's always thinking of the next thing, or always thinking about their level of impact that you can leave for the next generation, for those around us, like, what is that legacy of Chelsea Miller?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a great question. I don't know. I'm really good at talking about the things that I've done and what I'm doing now, but ask me about the future and I'm like, oh, God will handle it. But what I will say is I am really just getting started, right? Yeah. And I know that that's crazy because I've done so much, you know, and I don't even say that in a boastful way. I do that because it's wild how much I've actually done at 26 now, you know, and I think that for me, I didn't realize how much I've accomplished until people have had to remind me, right? Until I show up to these events, until I'm being honored on these platforms, and I'm like, okay, I'm doing what I need to do, right? I'm creating and putting into the world the version of myself that is allowing these things to essentially unlock, right? And so the question then becomes, what else do I want to unlock? You know, and I'm really big on, I know people talk about manifesting.
We do this on our show, by the way. We've seen multiple occasions where things they talked about in the show, we see them
and then it happens.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So talk to me about it.
Manifesting? Well, manifesting plus prayer. But I will say that for me, I want to make sure that I am building a platform that is big enough to shake everything up. And the way that I'm planning on doing that is across every single industry that I can touch. And so I think that the biggest thing right now is to put in pieces, and this is what I've been working on over the past couple of months, put the things in place essentially to be able to do that. You know, and it's funny because I feel like I sound like I'm trying not to give too much away.
Yeah.
I think that maybe a part of it is a lot of things that I do I can't talk about, but I think it's also another piece of it is that this work, you never know. You know, and I know that may sound bizarre, but it's true, because I may think that I'm going to be working on policy next week, and before you know it, I'm on the front lines again, right? That's what happened in, I think it was January, February, with the death of Tyree Nichols.
Yeah.
Right? I was in Ghana. The plan was to spend, the beginning of the year in Ghana. I was doing stuff with the diaspora, a lot of great work. And then as soon as I touched down in New York, I had to help lead a protest in the city for Tyree Nichols. And so in my mind, right, what I see as next steps is, again, building this platform. And I don't necessarily think that it needs to be in the form of being an elected official, even though, I've had a lot of mentors say, Chelsea, get ready because we're going to tap you in. But for me, I think the biggest part is doing the work. And I don't think that you need to do the work with a title all of the time, because I've found that oftentimes that creates the most hurdles for you to be able to do the things that you need to do. And then I would say globally as well, doing a lot of work on a global scale of connecting the diaspora and ideas around Black liberation and telling the stories between the work that we're seeing now, but also the work that has come before, and how do we use that to tell stories about the future. And so a lot of that is also going to be creating my own platform for how we're able to disseminate information, how we're able to share these stories, right? I've been on PBS, BET, have done so many different works with various platforms, but I think now it's important to create one and sustainably think about a place where I can house, right, my thoughts, my advocacy, my voice, and create a community around that can also learn some of these skills and build on their toolkit to also do this work in their communities. And so essentially building out like a global network, right, for this sort of work, and continuing to do stuff in the media space, continuing to do activists and residencies. I've been on tour this year, which has been a lot of fun, traveling to different colleges, universities, giving keynotes to students, and so that's been really amazing. And I'll be doing that throughout, the end of this year. So there's a lot that's always happening. And so I don't know, we'll see. There might be a vacancy and I might need to run for office, but if I don't need to, I'm not going to, because there's other things I need to get done. So I think that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Chelsea, we can't wait to see all of that. And like I said, we manifest on the show. So we're going to touch base and we're going to, keep in touch and make sure that all of this really rolls out for you. And I wanted to take this time to really, share this moment with you, but also give you the space, give myself the space to give you your flowers. And give you your flowers because not only that you deserve them, but for all the incredible work that you're doing, for the many people that might be tuning in to our conversation today that you already uplifted, inspired, changed their perspective to take on and be okay with where they are. I think when you talk about you are being enough and talk about to your younger self and understand that you are enough where you are and it's okay to be there, thank you for that reminder. Because oftentimes the level of comparison, the level of self-doubt, the level of the media is always changing, the new headlines, we always forget that, right? And you serving as a reminder to being in this space, to seeing the work that you're doing, but also seeing the work that you're doing only at 26, and you keep telling us that you're only getting started, we can't wait to see that. So I wanted to give you your flowers for all that you do and who you are.
Well, I definitely appreciate that, and I'll give you your flowers right back, because it's important to be able to create these spaces for our community, you know, and to have these conversations. And I'm definitely happy to hear that you all are seasons deep in doing this work, because it definitely is not easy. And as someone who has done a lot of production work and events and planning, it is absolutely not easy. But, you know, I just think that it's important for us to be able to have these spaces, and you obviously are creating your own legacy with this.
Wow.
So I'm excited to see what's next for you guys.
Wow, thank you. We got an incredible team here, you know, really making a way to make all this happen. And you beat me to it, actually. We always flip it back to the guests. I was saying, you know, who would you give your flowers to?
Oh, I already gave away flowers.
You know, but listen, I just want to say thank you again for just being so present, for being with us today, for creating this space and creating the energy. And like I said, we can't wait to what the future holds for you.
Amen.
Amen.
Signed, sealed, and delivered.
Absolutely. But, you know, I definitely wanted to take this time as well to give flowers to all those who are on the front lines, all those who are creating social impact each and every day, who are holding conversations in spaces like this, to just talk about your stories, amplifying your stories, whether it's in your household, whether it's in your neighborhoods, in your communities, in the country, or even on global footprints, right, in the media. Share your stories, share your truth. You never know who you're going to inspire.
Absolutely.
You know, so Chelsea, with that, you know, it's a wrap. But thank you so much again for being here, creating this space and this opportunity for us to learn a little bit more, and wish you all the best.
No, of course. Thank you.
And there you have it. That was Off the Cuff with Chelsea Miller.